Hello, this is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside. Tonight I'm going to talk about something that is almost a taboo subject, but it's called war. I believe it was General Sherman from the War of Southern Rebellion who called war hell. He said war is hell. On a different note, Hawkeye from MASH said, "They say war is hell." Well, war is war and hell is hell, and war is worse. From a theological standpoint, I disagree with Hawkeye, but then I have to look at it from another standpoint, and I actually agree with him. Hell was designed for people who refused to repent. War catches people who are innocent. It catches up the innocent. We're seeing that daily in Ukraine. We've seen it on our TV screens every time there has been a war. Yes, soldiers die, but in many cases, innocents die as well. And I'm very much concerned now as I look at the events that are going on. I was born in the end of 1943. Now you're going to say, oh, you were only a year and a half old when it ended. You can't possibly remember. I remember a tank sitting out in front of our house when German prisoners got out of the POW camp at Michaud. I was living at Hunter's Run. I remember that tank there. Do I remember a lot of others? No, really not much. But I remember that. I remember the train stopping at the crossing of Pine Grove Road, blowing the whistle, so that my dad would go up and help take the prisoners from there to the Michaud camp. I remember him doing that. I remember him going out at night like that. Probably didn't really at the time understand what it was about, but I knew it happened. And now I'm looking at a situation that I will not say gives me fear, but it gives me pause. I am seeing us in Ukraine doing everything short of war. And I've heard that phrase before. Everything short of war. What is everything short of war? Okay, let's talk about it. And let's look at some history. I'm going to digress here for a second. When we ignore history, we are condemned to repeat its failures. When we fail to learn history, we will repeat its failures. And quite frankly, right now, we have people in this country trying to erase our history because it somehow offends them, or alter it because it somehow offends them. History is history. But what does it mean, everything short of war? Let's go back. Go back to 1914. My dad was 2 years old when this happened. A guy by the name of Archduke Ferdinand was shot by a Serb. And things started to happen in Europe. And one country after another piled in on the free-for-all. It's like a group of kids on a playground. And two of them start fighting, and then another joins, and another joins. And pretty soon we have the war that has two names. The Great War, because they thought it was the end of war, and World War I, which we hear as now, because we realize it wasn't the war to end all wars that it was portrayed to be. Woodrow Wilson was elected president the end of 1914. Part of his platform was, we're not getting into a European war. He was still president in April of 1917 when we stepped across the boundary and entered World War I. But did we cross that boundary in April of 1917, or did we really sneak across it earlier than that? Let's take a look. We started helping the British, sort of ostracized the Germans. If you want to see how much we built up a hatred for Germans in the United States, look up the Krill Committee or the CPI, the Committee for Public Information, which was run by the Wilson government. It was a program of not just propaganda, but horribly, horribly hateful propaganda. It resulted in German Americans being ostracized. We were supplying Britain with arms. Is that an act of war? Trading with one of the belligerents without trading with the other. The Lusitania, that ship that supposedly caused all of the problem, was sunk in May of 1915. War had only been going on for about 13 months then. What was our position? By the way, we were still 2 years from declaring war. But the Lusitania, when it was sunk, was carrying American citizens into a war zone. And it was sunk, and we considered that a horrible thing. Unrestricted submarine warfare. But then, let's get some honesty. In the late 1970s, a book was written about what was really in the Lusitania's cargo. Remember that a passenger ship in those days had a large hold that they would throw cargo in. Some of that cargo included something called gun cotton, which is used for making naval shells. Another part of that hold contained several million rounds of rifle ammunition. The Brits must have been doing a lot of deer hunting. And it also contained a large quantity of brass rods, small brass rods. They're used by extrusion processes to make cartridge cases and bullets. Now, I'm sure that the Brits were really making brass lamps out of those. And there were other things in that hold. And then there was the Black Tom explosion, the island off of New York that just suddenly blew up one night. What was there that blew up? A whole lot of ammunition and explosives that were being sited there temporarily before they could be put on ships going to, you guessed it, Britain. We were supplying the British. And some of our big companies were very complicit in this. Some of them bent the rules to ship things, and some of them were shipping things with the federal government just turning its head. We were making money. Didn't matter. And that's where we were at. And suddenly we get self-righteous because American citizens have been killed. But we've been fighting the war for 2 years, at least 2 years. Everything short of war. It's an interesting phrase. When does it become war? And if you think that was the only time, well, I've got some bad news. 1949, September, Hitler invaded Poland. It took about a month to knock off Poland. And then the British are suddenly under attack, and they're hanging on by their knuckles. And we institute something called Lend-Lease, where we leased 50 destroyers. We claimed they were over age in exchange for some British territorial spots, usually military bases. Do you know what we really did by taking over those bases? We freed the British from having to defend them. This wasn't a gift. This was, in fact, the reverse. We were giving the British troops to protect those bases. And that wasn't the only thing. We put our destroyers in the Atlantic, helping to escort convoys. Now they have orders that you do not fire on a submarine unless you're fired upon. There are several engagements in which there are questions about who took the first shot. Those destroyers were out there, and American merchant ships were out there, and if they spotted a submarine, they reported it. and that was reported to the British. If you're a submarine captain in the Atlantic, the last thing you want is somebody reporting where you're at. Somewhere along the line, we were providing the British with intelligence, weapons, and even pushing the edge of fighting. Let's go over to the Pacific. Early 1941, we sent a bunch of pilots to China to fight the Japanese. Interesting. American Army pilots, couldn't fight the Japanese because we weren't at war. So they just resigned their commissions with a wink, wink, nod, nod by the Army and Navy and went off to fight the Japanese. There's another name for this, by the way. It's called mercenary. But we never like to use those words. We never like to tell it what it is. A duck is a duck. If it looks like a duck, waddles like a duck, quacks like a duck, and is seen in the company of ducks, it is almost certainly a duck. And these things were belligerent acts, and you do not commit belligerent acts when you are not at war. Interesting sidelight. Let's suppose one of those American destroyers shoots at a German submarine, and they get taken off the ship because the ship sinks, and the subcrew picks them up. Technically, they're not at war. The Geneva Convention does not apply. If the submarine captain wants to have them walk the plank, so to speak, I don't know if a sub has a plank, but I'm sure that they could construct some reasonable facsimile. He is totally justified in having them walk the plank. Now, for those of you who do not know what walking the plank means, is they extend a plank from the ship and you walk out until you walk off the end. And there is no rescue attempt made. Think about that. We also cut off all supplies of oil and scrap iron from the Japanese. We committed more than a few belligerent acts against the Japanese. Everything short of war. Really, was it short of war? Now let's come to today. And I want you to understand that I am very sympathetic of the Ukrainian people. I hope they kick royal Russian butt. I'm serious about that. And I also want you to remember that this is not the first time that Russia has invaded Ukraine. And somebody's going to say, oh yeah, 2015, Crimea. Yep. But go back a lot further than that. After World War II, the Russians invaded Ukraine and made it part of the Soviet Union. That was not a vote by the Ukrainian people to have happen. That was a takeover, and the USSR did that to several countries. I want us to help the Ukrainians, but I want us to understand that we are standing on a very slippery slope, and at the bottom of that slope is a nuclear abyss. Let me rephrase that. We have two madmen in the world right now who have the nuclear codes. One of them is named Putin. The other one sits in the White House. They have the nuclear codes. And God help us if one of them decides to blink. I don't even want to think about that. I know how bad it can get because I've studied nuclear war. I know how bad it can get. And I don't know where it would stop. I can only hope and pray that if one of the two of them were to order an attack, that our military would refuse and the Russian military would refuse to carry it out. In one of my novels, I explore this. It comes from the movie Crimson Tide, actually. I'm using it as the Crimson Tide story as a playoff. In that novel, the president has gone over the edge, and a psychologist's husband questions her. Wouldn't the military refuse that order? Now, his wife, psychologist, was also ex-military. And she answers him, I can't for sure say that Bart Mancuso would not. Now, for those of you who don't know Crimson Tide well, it's a submarine that gets a scrambled order to fire. A boomer, a missile sub that gets an order to fire. Mancuso is the captain. Denzel Washington plays the executive officer. And it is a major go-around between them of whether they fire or not. But let's look at what's going on in those heads. You're a boomer captain. You're out there. The last couple of weeks you've had Russian subs nearby. A couple of them have trailed you for a while, and then you've given them the slip. And you think right now you've given them the slip. They aren't there. You get an order to fire, and you say, okay, if I go up to make contact with the world, and I haven't had contact with the world for 6 or 7 days, I don't know what's happening out. Things could have turned to crap. That's number one. But if I go up, I expose my position. I become more exposed, and I become a primary target. If that Rusky is out there, he's going to want to take me out. Let's suppose I just fire all 24 missiles, and they go winging on their way. And let's say that Russian sub's out there, and of course, by now, he knows where the boomer's at, if he was anywhere near it, because he's heard the noises of firing. Because firing missiles is not quiet. But he says to himself, let's see, if I go after that sub, he may be able to destroy me. And he's already fired, so he has no value unless he can get back and reload. That's time consuming. Lots of time. There are other boomers out there that maybe haven't fired yet. Maybe I should concentrate on them. And now that boomer becomes a secondary target, not a primary. What's going through Bart Mancuso's head at that point? I cannot definitively say that a boomer captain would not fire. I thought through that with writing that book. I haven't thought through some of the others. What goes on in people's heads are sometimes some of the most important things you can know. So where are we at today? We've got 2 unstable men with the nuclear codes. I'm not so sure that unstable is not underestimating the risk. That's number 1. Number 2, we're shipping arms to Ukraine. Lots of them. And oh, by the way, they're helping the Ukrainians chew up the Russian columns. We can see that. Do you think Putin is happy with that? Then let's go to the next step. We've provided intelligence to Ukraine. That's like those destroyers and merchant ships spotting the German submarines. Everything short of war. I keep going back to that. Everything short of war. And I get concerned. Believe me, I get concerned. Are we doing everything short of war? Or have we stepped across the boundary? And on the other side of that boundary, is there something terrible? In addition to that nuclear arsenal, there's also another arsenal that the Ruskies have. And that's the cyber attacks. We had one cyber attack here a couple months ago that caused a horrible gas shortage in the Northeast. And that was created without even any of Joe Biden's help. And right now, the reason for our gas prices being where they're at is because of a shortage of oil. Let's be frank. Our president pulled the plug, turned the tap off, and now we're paying for it. He's allowed hundreds of thousands of immigrants, no, not immigrants, illegal immigrants, to cross the border. He's had flights flying them into the middle of the country. We've had them landing here in Pennsylvania. He has broken many things with his catering to the radical left. And we are now not in a position, if Putin does something stupid. Suppose he shuts down that pipeline and suddenly half of the United States doesn't have gas, or a quarter of it doesn't have gas. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. We just all go out and buy electric vehicles. Yeah, sure. First thing is, there ain't enough of them. Second thing is, there isn't enough electricity to fuel them. There isn't going to be enough. We keep closing power plants. We just closed TMI, Unit 1. 967, I believe it is, megawatts. Almost 1,000 megawatts. That'll handle a lot of EVs, but it's gone. And oh, by the way, they're trying to close Bruner Island because it burns coal. And Bruner Island is one of the cleaner plants around because the company has been forced to put scrubbers in the stacks and all kinds of other things. And wind and solar are great. And I'm a proponent of increasing our wind and solar. But let us be realistic. Right now, it's producing less than 8%. It's taken 30 years to get to that. We're not going to get there. I haven't done the figures for Pennsylvania, but I did them for California. If Governor Newsom were to be able to snap his fingers today and turn every car in California to an EV, just boom, snap your finger or wiggle your nose like Samantha, and every car becomes an EV. A good lowball estimate, and I understand when I do a lowball estimate, I estimate everything low. A good lowball estimate would cause the power consumption in California to go from 100% as it is now to 170%. Now, okay, you say, well, that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over the next 20 years. California is deactivating power plants. They are not building any new power plants. They are not building any new transmission lines to get it in from somewhere else. Their infrastructure is barely making it right now with the load that it has. A 10% increase turns them into rolling blackouts. And Pennsylvania is, I doubt, much better off. We might have a 15% cushion rather than the 5 to 7 that California has. That's where we're at. And we're now getting ready to put ourselves in a position of fighting a war when the home front is in shambles. And let me be frank, it wasn't there on January the 21st, 2021. We were ragged around the edges because of COVID. We are now in shambles. 7% inflation. Family of 4 is going to cost them $5,600 more this year. That's over $400 a month of their income that just went to a new tax called inflation, because inflation is driven by government. Now you may understand a little bit of why I get concerned when we are doing everything short of war. This is Ralph Brandt from the Fireside.